Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Fulton. I'm the director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research here at Rice University in Houston, and welcome to our Urban Reads series. The Kinder Institute Urban Reads series showcases recently published books by regional and national authors dealing with topics about cities. Today, our book and our featured author is Leslie Kern, author of the just published book, Feminist City, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World. You please live tweet today from this event. We ask that you use hashtag KI Urban Reads, hashtag KI Urban Reads. And we ask that you follow us on Twitter at Rice Kinder INST, Rice Kinder INST. And if you have any questions, either during or after the presentation, drop them not in the chat box, but in the Q&A box. And the reason that's important is that then other people can like your question, or you can like other people's questions, and those questions will move to the top of the pile, and we're more likely to be able to get to them and answer them in real time today. The Urban Read series is made possible thanks in large part to our friends at Centerpoint Energy, the title sponsor of this lecture series. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Gloria Bounds from Centerpoint for a few brief remarks. Gloria, welcome.
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Gloria Bounds, and on behalf of Centerpoint Energy, I'd like to welcome you to the Kinder Institute's Urban Reads, featuring author Leslie Kern on Feminist City. We're proud to partner with and support the Kinder Institute for Urban Research to present valuable webinars such as this. We're a customer-focused energy delivery company with electric transmission and distribution, power generation, and natural gas distribution operations, and we serve more than 7 million customers in 8 states. We're committed to working and serving responsibly for our customers and our communities every day. Delivering electricity and natural gas to millions of customers across our communities takes the energy of everyone in a diverse and inclusive environment where we respect, understand, and appreciate each other, those we serve and the people around us. Diversity and inclusion are core to who we are, what we do, and how we do it. We believe that diversity and inclusion are critical components of our long-term business strategy, and they're serving as our cornerstones of our service, performance, and growth. We strive to find ways big and small to appreciate the value in our differences. It's through the energy of many where we will unlock the potential of our company and the workforce, while at the same time supporting our quest to learn better, listen better, and do better every day. Speaking of diversity, as a minority woman working for a utility, I'm proud that we're making great strides to make more and more female employee placements. And in 2020, 31% of our placements were female employees, 6% more gender diverse than the average workforce of the energy utility industry. We still have a lot of work to do, and we will continue on that journey. Personally, as a mother of 2 young children, living in the city and working in corporate America, I'm really looking forward to hearing from Leslie today. On behalf of Centerpoint Energy, thank you and welcome.
All right, thank you, Gloria. We also want to recognize the generous support we receive from other philanthropic sources, including a multi-year grant from Houston Endowment and philanthropic investments from other contributors. Special thanks go to Nancy and Rich Kinder and the Kinder Foundation, Laura and Tom Bacon, the Baxter Trust, the Hewlett Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the William T. Grant Foundation, Chevron, JP Morgan Chase Foundation, Wells Fargo, the Cullen Foundation, Raynette and Stan Merrick, the Spencer Foundation, PNC Bank, Claire and Eric Anya, Arnold Ventures, Catherine and Hank Coleman, Sis and Hasty Johnson, Becky and Ralph O'Connor, Bank of America, Bracewell, HEB, and the United Way of Greater Houston. So now it's time for me to introduce Leslie Kern, our speaker today. And Leslie, there you are. Great. Leslie is the author of 2 books on gender and cities, including the just published book, Feminist City, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World. She holds a PhD in Women's Studies from York University and is currently an Associate Professor of Geography and Environment and Director of Women and Gender Studies at Mount Allison University. She writes about gender, gentrification, and feminism, and teaches urban, social, and feminist geography. So with that, I would like to turn it over to the author of Feminist City, our guest today, Leslie Kern. Leslie, thanks for being here.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, and Thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this really wonderful book-related series. So, as Bill mentioned, I'm a professor at Mount Allison University, which is located in what is currently known as Sackville, New Brunswick, Canada, but is part of the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet peoples with whom we are governed by ongoing treaties of peace and friendship. My pronouns are she, her, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my book, but I thought that I would present a little bit what I mean by the man-made city and what are some principles that we could think of as a way of guiding a transition towards a vision, a possibility, the potential of the feminist city. When I wrote this book, I was interested in inviting a wider audience of people to look at the environments around them, especially cities, in a new light, to ask a different set of questions about why things look the way they are, why things are organized the way they are, why the buses run in a particular direction at a particular time, and so on. And to start to question things that we take for granted. The built environment is so durable. It's there before us. It's going to be there after us, that a lot of the time we don't necessarily pause and reflect on how it came to be this way, whose interests are being served, who is in power in terms of making these decisions, and what kinds of different outcomes do different groups of people face when they are confronted with the various environments that constitute kind of the water that we swim in. The book itself is not so much a blueprint for how we move from point A to point B, but more a set of values around which we might shape our cities and our relationships. So in our time together today, my objective is to expose or shed a little extra light onto some of the inequalities that are built right into our cities and buildings, and to ask, what can we do about it? So we can start with this question: who is the city for? And its flip side, right? Who is the city not for? So I'm going to invite you as the audience to think about some questions. If you feel like sharing your answers in the chat, you can feel free to, but otherwise you can just reflect to yourself. Who among us has ever changed their route home due to safety concerns? Who has ever found that the urban infrastructure around you is difficult to use or not made for your body or your abilities? Who has ever been pregnant and tried to move around the city, or been a caretaker of babies or small children and tried to make your way on public transit or down a crowded street? Who has been unable to find a bathroom when you needed it, or one that matched your gender identity and your physical ability? Who among us has ever had our presence in a space questioned or challenged? I suspect that for many people, one or more of these questions will have some resonance and will be answered with a resounding yes. I think that in particular, many women, trans, and non-binary people know about the man-made city on a very gut level. They don't necessarily need it explained in academic language, but at the same time, talking about it gives us a kind of common language and a sense that, oh, it's not all in my head. I'm not just experiencing something different as an individual. For many of us, we experience the exclusions of the city in a very embodied way, on a very everyday level, a very kind of minute-to-minute experience. And taken together, all of these things add up to a series of moments that let a lot of people know that the city is not really for you. All right, so when we talk about the idea of the man-made city, what we're getting at is the male-dominated realms of urban planning, development, construction, architecture, and other industries. I like to say a lot of the time that you can't build, plan, or design for what you don't see or don't know, or at least you're not likely to do it terribly well. So the man-made city is both a concept and a reality that I think we need to deconstruct. The image on this page is a capture of the cover of a book that was published in the UK in 1987 from a group called the Matrix Collective, a feminist collective of architects and others who are interested in the built environment. The book was titled Making Space, Women and the Man-Made Environment. And I love the kind of blurb on the bottom of the book that says, a stiff challenge to the great macho myths of metropolitan architecture. Now, I like to show this image of this book to remind both myself and others that the ideas that I talk about in Feminist City are not particularly new, and they're not unique to me. People have been talking about this for quite a long time, not just beginning in 1987, but going back much further than this. So these ideas have a long legacy, and yet there's still a lot of ground to cover in bringing them more into the mainstream. So that's one little piece of my mission. Okay, so as I mentioned, fields like planning, urban design, architecture, and urban policymaking are still male-dominated fields. Beyond that, when we talk about the man-made city, we could also note that in many cases, the male body, its height, its shape, its weight, and so on, is taken as the universal standard in design. The city itself is set up to prioritize a typical, at least typical in a particular moment in time, a typical male pattern of movement into and out of the city. And the city and in its organization is full of gendered assumptions about home, about work, about what counts as public or private space. And all of these really saturate our buildings and our cities. So I'm going to, through my presentation, kind of go through each of these and explain them in a little more detail with some examples. So this question, who builds the city? Well, from information that I could find publicly available, in Canada, where I live, about 28% of licensed architects are women. In the United States, it's about 17%. And this is an interesting number because in undergraduate architecture education programs, the numbers are at least 50-50 and sometimes more women than men in these programs. And yet something happens along the way between going to architecture school, graduating, getting licensed, working as an architect, where we see those numbers for women really drop off quite steeply. This can be attributed to a number of factors about how the profession of architecture has historically been male dominated and some of the impacts of that on the working conditions. So for example, there remains unequal gendered pay within the field of architecture. There tends to be long working hours that are coupled with quite inflexible or non-family friendly time schedules and working hours. Women often find themselves sidelined to limited areas of work. So for example, they're not asked to work on the glamorous skyscraper projects, but they are sort of hived off to work on small residential developments or public parks and so on. There are very stressful working conditions in the field that result in some negative job satisfaction and the desire for many to seek that satisfaction elsewhere. And of course, there remains a kind of a macho culture, sexism, and sexual harassment, just as we see in so many other professions. Beyond architecture, in the world of planning, in the United States, about 48% of urban and regional planners are women, which is a good number. However, there's still some differentiation in terms of who are the chief planners, right? Who are at the top of that hierarchy in the field. And unfortunately, that field is not as racially diverse as it could and should be. About 80% of planners are white or identify as white. And honestly, aside from Jane Jacobs, very few women urbanists, either as scholars, architects, planners, designers, are widely known or seen as influential. So our ideas and both the reality of who builds the city is still a fairly male-dominated and quite white world. Back in 1977, a women urbanist, a feminist urbanist that I think everybody should know about, Dolores Hayden, who was herself trained as an architect and worked kind of as an architect architecture and planning critic, excuse me. In 1977, she published an article in the feminist journal Heresies that was called Skyscraper Seduction, Skyscraper Rape. And she was talking about this very question of who builds the city. And she was focused on the skyscraper as a particular manifestation of what she called a masculinist urban power fantasy. So yes, we could talk about the skyscraper as a symbolic manifestation of the phallus, but what Hayden was getting at was that, we're not so much concerned with that particular imagery, but with the idea that the skyscraper would represent a kind of monument to masculine and capitalist corporate power, the competitive drive to colonize yet higher and higher levels of the city, the technological competition to see, who could be the first to solve certain structural and engineering problems that would allow the skyscraper to reach greater and greater heights. What Hayden points out in this article is that all of this fantasy of what the skyscraper represents in terms of progress and power and innovation and so on is one that actually hides a lot of very real violence. So she talks, for example, about the dangerous work of constructing skyscrapers, and lest we believe that this is all in some kind of, pre-unionized past, we can look around the world today and see that, especially in places where the competition to build the ever taller structures in ever shorter periods of time, that work is still incredibly dangerous and is often done by undocumented or highly exploited migrant workers in places around the world. So the skyscraper itself hides an enormous amount of danger and even death of those who work on the buildings themselves. Hayden points out that the myth of the sort of corporate wealth and dominance of the skyscraper hides the reality of a lot of bankruptcy, right? That the success of the businesses that fill the skyscrapers is certainly not guaranteed. She also talks about the skyscraper as a site that can and has been destroyed. Of course, she's writing in 1977 before the kind of, modern terrorist area, but certainly in our lifetime, we've seen the incredible destruction that can be wrought against buildings like this. And she also points out that, the idea that the skyscraper represents kind of a pinnacle of corporate wealth and profit also hides a great deal of inequality. So even if we think about who is working within the skyscraper, we could think about a gender division, right? Who is doing the secretarial and clerical work in that space. We could also think about, class, gender, and race differences in terms of who is coming in and cleaning the spaces of the skyscraper at night, who is doing the maintenance work in this space, who is serving all of the professional workers of that space. So essentially, when we're thinking about who builds a city, we can also think about what is being represented through those processes and what identities and ways of being are kind of minimized or neglected. In attending to the idea of the man-made city, we can also ask whose bodies are the norm. So to the extent that the human body is considered in urban design, and I think we could probably all come up with some examples where it really doesn't seem like people thought about humans using spaces at all, but even when the human body is considered, it's often what is seen as an average, i.e. like North American or European male body that is taken as the standard. This means that the height, weight, strength, and typical comfortable body temperature and more are set to normal for a male body. So anyone who's ever worked in one of those, skyscrapers or any kind of modern office in the summer where the air conditioning temperature is set will often notice that women are shivering and covering up in sweaters while men are overheating in their wool suits. And this is not really an accident, and it's not just about fashion. It's also about whose most comfortable body temperature is, taken as the temperature that offices should ideally be set at. When we look at something like a crowded subway car in the image on this PowerPoint slide, many of us have had the experience of not really being able to reach up and reach those handrails above because they are set to a height that is not accessible for everybody. In my hometown of Toronto, as I was doing research for this book, I found that in city planning guidelines, when they are considering whether a new tall building will create a wind tunnel effect on the street, the body that they are taking in terms of imagining what the effect on a pedestrian will be is this, average adult male. So they're not considering what the effect of that wind tunnel experience would be on children's bodies, on women's bodies, or on anyone who doesn't fit into that average. So this is all very inconvenient and very annoying, right? But it also goes beyond that. The inconvenience and discomfort is one thing, but there are also very serious harms and even risk of death that comes from the inequalities in the way that spaces, workplaces, and so on are designed. Now, Carolyn Criado-Perez does a wonderful job of exposing all of this in her book from a couple of years ago called Invisible Women. Some of the things that she points out, that women have higher rates of workplace-related injuries, illnesses, and deaths. And it's not because women are just somehow weak and more vulnerable to these things. It's that the workplace itself is not set up to accommodate their bodies. Again, there are standard male norms that are used to calculate the risk of something like, for example, a chemical exposure. So the amount of a hazardous chemical that can be in the air at a workplace. This is the safety of this is calculated based on how much is seen to be safe for a standard male worker and not for a female worker, not for a pregnant worker, and so on. This is not necessarily great for men either, to be exposed to chemical hazards in the workplace, but even then we see that there's a gender difference. A lot of safety equipment in the workplace does not fit women well. So around the start of the pandemic, you might have noticed some news stories about how personal protective equipment is not really designed to fit on smaller bodies, like face masks and even gowns and so on. There was a story a little while back about a spacewalk being delayed for 3 women astronauts because they didn't have enough spacesuits that fit women's bodies. But even if you're not going up into space, if you are a police officer or in the military, things like bulletproof vests don't fit particularly well over the chests of people who have breasts, for example. Harnesses and safety belts and so on also fit differently when you have wider hips and based on the distribution of your body weight and body fat, all of those kinds of things make a difference. Often the tools that people use in their work are, again, not designed to accommodate the different typical strength levels or areas of body strength of the average woman versus the average man. So tools can be too big or too heavy, causing sprains and injuries. Voice recognition software often mishears women's voices compared to men's voices, and this can have implications for the route that you're taking to get somewhere, or perhaps the technology that you need just in order to be able to do your job. And often the safety tests that are done on everything from cars to appliances and so on are only performed either with men or with typical men's measurements or with male-sized dummies like crash test dummies. So this means that women are kind of going about their day-to-day lives in the city as they go to work, as they move through space in a world that is literally not designed for them and is in many cases actively doing them harm. Design. Sorry, let me back up as I transition here for a second. So there are other kinds of gender binaries that are built into the world of design that are not just about how people use space, but they are about kind of how we conceive of space, the symbolic value that we place on different spaces. So in architecture, there is still to this day, conversation about masculine versus feminine design elements. So if you look at the 2 images on the screen, both of museum spaces where we have the Guggenheim in New York on the left-hand side of the screen, and the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto that is in the middle of the screen. And you probably don't need a degree in gender studies to imagine which of these is considered to be more of a feminine design and which of these would be considered to be more of a masculine design. So why does that matter? Well, it continues to kind of cement the idea that that gender is a binary, right? That there are just two genders and they are opposite in many ways, both in terms of how we think about their roles in the world, but also how we visualize what those genders are all about. So it's still kind of infused into the design world. In thinking about what counts as masculine versus feminine physical features, this can also end up having an effect in terms of the way that we perceive and value different sorts of designs, because of course there's a differential value placed on what counts as feminine versus masculine in male-dominated cultures such as ours. It may also influence the kind of perception of the work of women architects versus men architects. How are they conforming or not conforming to particular gender expectations in their design work? This also plays out kind of at the city level when we talk about things like hard versus soft infrastructure. So hard infrastructure would be like your roads and your subway tunnels and your sewage systems, whereas soft infrastructure is like social infrastructure, care infrastructure, places of social interaction, and so on. And often in city politics, there ends up being kind of a division in terms of who is put in charge of hard versus soft infrastructures. And often the so-called hard infrastructures are seen as, the more critically important things, the things we have to invest in, where we have to put the most, millions and billions of dollars and so on. And of course, on a very everyday level, we know that in most public and private spaces like businesses, schools, museum institutions, such as those on the screen, we still have male and female designated spaces. So there's still the idea that there's a gender binary that along this binary of male, female, that people need to be kept separate. And, this is obviously exclusionary towards people who don't neatly fit into that gender binary or who don't want to, or whose use of these spaces might go contrary to what is typically expected. So we know that in many cases, bathrooms that are designated for men only don't have spaces like baby changing tables, right? So the assumption is that men are not doing that care work in those spaces. All right, the third question that we can come to then is thinking about whose lives are the norm. So talking about whose bodies are taken as the norm, but going beyond that to think about whose day-to-day experiences of the city, whose needs, whose ways of making a living and so on are taken to be the standard around which the city is designed. So the images on this slide are just a bunch of really very everyday spaces and so on. But I think that when we kind of look at them in a little more detail, we can recognize that they exemplify places where often the typical patterns, experiences, and embodiment of women are not really taken into consideration, or other kinds of priorities have been elevated. So in the kind of central image, we see people walking down a steep flight of steps to a subway tunnel. And of course, most transit systems that have underground spaces have these steps that you have to traverse. Not a lot of subway systems around the world are fully accessible, meaning having elevators or even escalators. So we know that if you're traveling with a stroller, or if you have a disability, or you're elderly and so on, these become very inaccessible spaces, which then, when we think, okay, who is excluded from these spaces, we have to ask, well, then who are these spaces designed for, right? Whose lives have been taken as the norm? So the able-bodied male commuter, unencumbered by children and babies and so on, he is the norm in this space. In the bottom left-hand corner, there's an image of a pedestrian underpass, so an area that pedestrians are supposed to walk through while the road goes above. Now, most women will probably look at this space and go, yeah, I'm not walking through there at night, maybe not even during the day. It doesn't look very welcoming. It looks dank. It probably smells. You don't know what's on the other side of it. These spaces are quite frightening and contribute to an overall sense of unsafety that many women express in cities. They also illustrate that we, in many places, especially here in North America, we've really elevated the car to the highest priority. So we've said that the most important thing in this space is for cars not to be halted by, a stoplight or a stop sign. So what we're going to do is dig this underground space. Oh, does it matter that half the population is like, nope, not walking through that? Not really. The most important thing here is the car. What else do we have in this image? Oh, some porta potties, right? Some portable toilets. Since the pandemic started, and even before, I find I've been talking about toilets quite a lot, toilets in public space, because people have been recognizing that, oh yeah, this really impacts your life in a lot of ways, whether there are toilets available that you don't have to pay or go inside a private business to use, whether those toilets are physically accessible, whether you can change a baby in that toilet, whether the toilet matches your gender identity or is open to all genders. These things really make a difference in people's day-to-day lives, but in so many cities around the world, public toilet provision is really quite terrible. It's in the toilet, we might say. In the final image, we have a sort of a classic New York City brownstone. Who doesn't love this image, right? They're so beautiful. But even something just as everyday as housing, when you look at the fact that there are probably 12 steps just to get up to the front door of this, if you are trying to traverse that with a toddler, a stroller, couple of bags of groceries, it's actually kind of a nightmare just to get in and out of that space. So what I'm getting at is that on a very everyday embodied level, there are all sorts of ways that certain kinds of lives have been taken as the norm and others have been at best neglected and at other times even, seen as kind of completely unimportant. We can also see whose lives are taken as the norm when we consider the way that cities have been zoned, right? So how they've been organized in terms of what land uses are allowed in what spaces. So in this particular image, you can see far off in the distance, the kind of central business district of the city, but you're kind of looking at a suburban or maybe even, outer suburban ring of the city that is fully residential. And in this particular organization of the city, again, reflects a male norm, or at least a societal norm that has suggested that it is one person in the household's job to leave the residential space, travel into the city, and then travel out again. That this is going to happen at particular times of the day, and that there will be somebody at home that stays at home to do the caretaking work there. So most of the transit systems that we have are kind of organized around this model of work, around the idea of the male breadwinner, and they have not really taken into account the modern reality, which is that even in heterosexual households, most people, most of the adults in those households work both inside and outside of the home, but many of the ways that we've set up the city don't facilitate that very well. So traveling to and from work is not just difficult in terms of the distance that one has to commute, but the difficulty is compounded by the need to drop off children at daycare or at school. The fact that for people in the service industry, which again is a lot of women, that your hours don't necessarily fall in this kind of 9 to 5 pattern, that you may be traveling during rush hour with children, and buses and subways are not really set up to accommodate this, and so on. I could go on and on about transportation. Even the modes of transportation that we prioritize. I mentioned a minute ago that we tend to prioritize the car. This is also gendered. In most cities, men are more likely to be the ones who have access to a private vehicle or who have access to it the most in a household. Women tend to take more pedestrian journeys, shorter journeys, like multiple shorter journeys in a day to take care of household and child-related needs, as well as get to their paid work. And women are more likely to use public transportation than men. So even thinking about which of those modes of transportation we prioritize, there are gendered impacts as well as racialized and class impacts there as well. And certainly the kind of expected gender norms that are built into this environment, even in 2021, we can still see kind of a legacy of a 1950s, 1960s norm of a gender division of labor that, we're going to make it possible for one person to commute in and out of the city, but we're going to expect that somebody else is kind of in the suburban home full time. And we know that in the post-war period, especially post-World War II, in places like the United States and to some extent Canada as well, that the suburbs were created and marketed very much with the idea that we would get women back in the home. We would give them a full-time unpaid job in the home to allow men back into the paid employment world, which was, of course, their entitlement based on their birth. At a more fine-grained level, when we think about just how people move through the city, again, I mentioned a minute ago some differences in transportation use, but there are these kind of like, we might again call them sort of fine-grained effects that when you don't prioritize things like pedestrian routes, what this means is that, for example, in the winter, you might not clear the snow from pedestrian routes or from school routes or residential areas as quickly as you clear it from major commuter roads. Often for anyone with a physical disability or senior citizens, urban public spaces are not very accessible, especially in winter, when snow and ice might be impacting your ability to move through the city. Often bike lanes, even where they have been implemented, and again, in many North American cities, we've been very hesitant to take away space from cars to give it more to bikes, but without physical barriers, bike lanes can still feel unsafe for many people, especially women who report feeling quite harassed, both by other cyclists and by drivers, and who also experience sexual harassment when they are out riding their bikes. And yeah, as I mentioned, there's a general lack of accessibility, physical accessibility in both our public transportation systems and our public spaces that really impact who feels that they are really welcome and encouraged to move about the city. The final issue that I'll talk about under this sort of theme of whose lives are the norm will be to just say a few words about safety. Obviously, we could spend a lot of time talking about the feminist city and safety questions, and maybe those will come up in our discussion. But I just want to note that often the kind of very top-down police and sometimes even military heavy approaches to urban safety and security, to my mind as a feminist, work to reinforce patterns of male dominance, right? So you say, let's make women safer by giving tons of money and weapons to incredibly male-dominated institutions like the police and the military. I don't know whether that, I think I know it doesn't really make women safer, but it tends to be the approach that many cities have taken. We've created a very kind of hardened urban architecture to supposedly protect us from threats like terrorism, everyday crime, and so on. But the reality is that this does not take into account women's most common experiences of violence, which tend to be in the home and or from men that they know. So our kind of urban approaches to safety, even when we think we're talking about women's safety, are often really ignoring that day-to-day reality. And of course, these top-down, police-heavy approaches to safety harm the most marginalized people in the city, including people of color, homeless people, queer folks, other people who are people who have psychiatric illness and so on, who are likely to be targeted or to experience violence at the hands of the police. And so, throwing them under the bus for the sake of some idea about creating safety for women is quite problematic. So again, when we're not really thinking about, well, what are women's lives like, for example, or what is the life of someone living on the streets like, then we are, creating urban environments that respond to one set of needs and are very neglectful or harmful towards other sets of needs. So if we were to think about transitioning toward a feminist city, what kind of principles might we keep in mind? So I'll just go through each of these briefly. One of the things that I like to talk about is the idea that the minority, or what we have been taught to think of as the minority, is actually the majority. So I've mentioned multiple times throughout this presentation that men's lives, men's bodies, men's experiences have been taken as the norm and kind of held up as if they represent the majority of people in society. And I would say that actually in most cities these days, that is probably a minority point of view. The people who fit into that mold are probably not the numerical majority. In fact, if you take together women, racialized people, poor people, seniors, people with disabilities, queer folks, those so-called niche interests or special interest groups and so on, we are actually the majority, right? We are not, a special interest that architects would think about kind of off to the side. No, if you are designing for those groups, you are designing for the majority. So a core principle to me of the Feminist City is to kind of flip that idea on its head and to recognize that what we've taken as the universal standard is in fact the niche, right? That white, able-bodied, cisgendered, breadwinning men who work 9 to 5 and commute from the suburbs, they are perhaps the special interest group and not everybody else. But that's not to say that they will somehow be left behind in the Feminist City. I think they'll probably be just fine. I also like to point out that we can kind of tell a different story about the cities that we live in. So we can use architecture, design, signage, statues, monuments, and so on to create a message of diversity and inclusivity. I don't think that, symbolic changes are the answer to the inequalities that plague cities. However, they are a great starting point. And if people are sitting there going, well, what can a city do today that's not going to cost millions of dollars to, create something different? Well, maybe you could rename some streets, right? Maybe you can create some spaces that are dedicated to different histories, undertold histories, ignored stories, ignored people in your community, right? To bolster that sense of inclusivity. I think a feminist city, a core principle is that we also have to prioritize care work, both as infrastructure and in infrastructure. So I think kind of a current running through much of what I have said today is the idea that in kind of prioritizing men's lives and experiences and deprioritizing women's, one of the effects of that is that we tend to ignore care work, or we assume that it's all being done in the home for free by women. And we haven't really thought about how we can bring all of that care work, both, caring for children, elderly people, caring for the environment, looking after one another, feeding people, and so on, how we can bring that into public space, both indoor and outdoor, how we can collectivize that work. It was interesting that in President Biden's infrastructure bill, he, attempted to include some elements of care work as infrastructure, so funding for support workers for elderly people, for example, right? And we've tended to think again about like hard and soft infrastructure as two totally different things, but to my mind, in a feminist city, we have to combine those things together and think about, well, how can we use our hard infrastructure to actually facilitate care work and maybe come up with some creative solutions to the inequalities that are part of that. To that end, I think rethinking the public and private divide that we tend to take for granted in our cities is also really important. So if we want to collectivize and share care work, we have to not assume that it is done in the enclosed private space of the home. We have to imagine different kinds of activities taking place in public space, whether that's, children learning outside, for example, or community kitchens, or even rest spaces, as this image shows here, taking rest out of the private space of the home and into the public realm. Again, kind of breaks down that divide, because as we know, often men's lives have been mapped into the public world and women's onto the private world. And the more we can kind of shake that up, question it, do different things, the more we can, I think, dismantle some of the gendered inequalities. I think it's also important to start from the body, but perhaps bodies would be a better way of putting that, to recognize that people have bodies, right? To that, if we want to think about creating really, livable, sustainable, interesting, fun, playful, safe cities, then we need to start from the body to recognize that human beings use the city. The city is not just the abstract idea of the economy, for example, but the city is a place that people need to do basic things like eat and drink and go to the bathroom. So it's not very glamorous, perhaps, to be an architect and to think about where people are going to go to the bathroom. But at the end of the day, these are the things that can really make a big difference in terms of how we experience the city. So I'll just close then with a quote from the feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed, who has a blog called the Feminist Killjoy blog, and one of the posts on that blog, she writes about feminist theory, and she says, feminist theory comes out of a description of a body that is not at home in the world. By this, I mean description as angle or point of view, a description of how it feels not to be at home in the world, or description of the world from the point of view of not being at home in it. And to me, I think that this really captures what a feminist perspective on the city is, one that comes out of a description or an experience of a body that is not at home in the city, because the city has not been made to make that body feel at home. And I guess I would also reiterate that we don't only have to start from a woman's body in order to come to a different point of view. A feminist or gendered lens is just one angle through which to do this work, but an understanding that there are multiple people, experiences, and bodies in the world that are not at home in the world is a great way to start thinking about how we can change what we've come to take for granted about cities and move towards a feminist, sustainable, just vision of our urban future. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Again, for those of you who are watching, and we have lots of people watching, if you have a question, there was one question in the chat, which I'll get to in a minute, but if you have a question, please put it into the Q&A. If there's a question in the Q&A that you like, please click like, and that'll move up the list and we're more likely to get to it. I wanted to start, Leslie, by asking a couple of questions. I was interested in Dolores Hayden's Skyscraper lecture. Dolores Hayden was actually my academic advisor in graduate school in urban planning, and I can remember at UCLA when she taught there, when she was giving that lecture, there would be buzz all across campus, and people would come from all across campus to watch that lecture. It was so popular. But I wanted to ask you, I wanted to go back to something you said toward the end about the public-private divide and bringing what are implicit in what you're saying, but correct me if I'm wrong, is that traditionally male activities were almost viewed as public activities, whereas female activities were viewed as private activities, and therefore not worthy, in your view, not worthy of consideration in designing the public realm. I think that's partly what you were saying, right? If you break down the public-private divide in the manner that you described, how does that manifest itself in the way, I don't know, cities or neighborhoods or transportation systems are designed?
That's a great question. And thank you for sharing your anecdote about Dolores Hayden too. That's really wonderful to hear. But yes, I think you are summarizing what I'm getting at and raising that question of, okay, well, then like, what does that actually look like? So I've been kind of pushed over the time since the book has been published to think more concretely about that. As someone who is not a planner or an architect or an urban designer, some of the things that it makes me think about, for one, would be the design of the home, right? In most places, we continue to prioritize the single family home. And by single family, I mean, the small kind of nuclear family that's come to, dominate our sense of what a normal expected family form is, still often a heterosexual family, a two-parent family. And in many ways, that doesn't reflect the modern reality. I mean, Dolores Hayden wrote about this when she was critiquing the suburbs, even back in the 1980s. She was like, this isn't the reality of most, American and what she was writing about cases. Families don't look like this. Families don't work this way. And yet our built environment still largely reflects this so-called ideal of what a family is. So in breaking down some of that public-private divide, one way to start to do that would be to kind of break apart what I would say the kind of the overly privatized single-family home, not to do away with it altogether. People need choice. Nobody wants to be told how to live. But to create a wider variety of housing forms that support different kinds of households, different kinds of relationships. This could be really beneficial for seniors, for example, for single people and so on. And it can also provide a way of collectivizing and sharing some of the care work that gets so hidden and made invisible and exploited within the private single family home. Bring it out into communal spaces, share it, have it be done by not just women, but and have it be valued.
I want to go on to some of the Q&A here, and I'll skip around between the chat, the Q&A, and a couple other questions I have. Ann Whitlock, this may be similar to the question I just asked, but Ann Whitlock asked, so what are some examples of designs that could come out of this, of your core principles to better serve the minority majority? You've talked a little bit about that. I'm wondering, in your research, and particularly as you've gone around, whether you've done that literally or virtually since this book came out, have you found good examples of urban design anywhere in the US or Canada that do reflect some of the values that you're describing?
Well, I think we are seeing, and again, North America is maybe slightly later to this game than some European cities, but more of an embrace of what is known as gender mainstreaming or gender planning or even gender analysis. So for example, major transportation systems, like public transportation systems in cities, taking it upon themselves to actually do a gender equity audit, essentially, of their services, right? To both find out how users, how riders are experiencing their services, and to also ask, what can we do as a transit system to tackle gender inequity, right? What can we do to actually make our services work for women and other marginalized genders? So the Los Angeles metro system is doing this work right now, going through, a really detailed process of trying to understand how women have been, disadvantaged on the transit system and what they can do to change that. I think, in cities like Toronto, for example, women's organizations were really at the forefront of kind of pushing the city and transportation systems to take women's safety seriously, both in the public realm and to a lesser extent in the private realm, but to not consider women's needs in public space to be secondary, or to not fall back on the oh so tired advice of, well, just don't go out late at night, or don't use public transportation, or don't do these things that seem dangerous. That's not really advice that most women can live by. If you have to get to work, if you have to pick up your kids, if you have to just live your life, right? You can't be limited in those ways. So actually, doing things like safety audits, right? Figuring out what spaces don't work and how to improve them. So, I think that work is happening. Some of it, has started like 30 or 40 years ago, and it's still sort of slowly chugging away to this day, but we are seeing those changes happen.
There was a question in the chat. It wasn't really a question. It was more kind of an incredulous comment that said, after looking at your slide that showed the underpass, and the comment was something like, so an underpass is inherently designed against women, I think that was more of an incredulous comment than a question, but I wanted to turn it around into a question, which is, how would you redesign that particular space? Would you inevitably want to put the pedestrians up top, or would it be possible to better design a tunnel, or what do you think the options are there?
Yeah, great question. Well, I think the solutions are going to be different depending on the particular context of the space. One thing we could do is to ensure that when these spaces are being designed, that actually the community is being consulted. So it may be that a pedestrian underpass is not a bad design idea for a particular community. It may be that it works just fine, but in other cases, it may be that it is actually quite problematic. So I think actually listening to the people who live there and the people who use that space to figure out, first of all, whether it's going to be an issue or not. If you are going to have a pedestrian underpass, what can you do to make that space feel safer, right? What kinds of lighting options, what kinds of sight lines do you need? What, other sorts of uses at one end of the tunnel or another do you need in order for there to be a perception of safety? There are ways to do these things. And in other cases, it might be that you decide, well, actually, this is a route that people walk to and from school, and families need to travel, multiple times a day. Maybe it's worth it to, divert traffic in some way or force traffic to stop. I recognize that there's a lot of, questions about, well, it's dangerous to cross the street. Cars are dangerous. But again, I think we've accepted for too long that it's like, well, then we just, kind of hide the pedestrians away instead of maybe like having less cars as an option too.
I'm just going to start going down the questions here. One question that got a lot of likes is, given that women's unpaid and hidden care labor has been and still is central to capitalist accumulation, how do you view anti-capitalist projects as related to urban planning? In other words, can feminist egalitarian urban planning exist within capitalism?
Well, ultimately and ideally, from my perspective, no. I consider, my own vision of a feminist city to be an anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-colonial project. But I also recognize that, that doesn't mean that we wait until that anti-capitalist utopia is upon us in order to start doing some of this work, that you can do things that improve people's lives today, now, next week, next month, that move us in that general direction. So I kind of hold a both and there, where to me, the ultimate expression of a feminist city is not one that is compatible with capitalism as we know it today. Yet at the same time, I'm not going to just wait for the revolution in order to start thinking about the changes that can happen right now, or about the things that people are already doing, right? The idea that the idea that somehow there's, until we have the grand vision that nothing is happening is very false, right? People have always engaged in work to improve their communities, their neighborhoods, their lives, and so on, without waiting for the state or corporations to get around to provide that for them. So I like to, try to pay attention to some of that work as well.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple more interesting questions here. I'm going to take them slightly out of order because I want to get to them. But one was, one viewer comments that cities often design spaces for preteen and teen boys rather than girls. And she's wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that happens and how one might counteract that.
Yeah, such a great question. And I totally agree. In my observation, I would follow along with that I think one of the reasons is that when we are thinking, we collectively, society is like, well, we need space for youth, we're kind of imagining like keeping youth out of trouble, right? We don't want youth to like fall into crime or to start vandalizing. We have to give them something to do. But really the youth that is like we're imagining in that moment is probably an adolescent boy or a young man, right? We're not really imagining young girls being troublemakers, but we might be imagining young girls as potentially being victims of harm in public space. So in some ways, we're not really thinking about how to get more girls out into public space. We still have these gendered perceptions. What can be done about it? Well, there's an organization in the UK that's called Making Space for Girls, and they do both research and advocacy work around how to improve public spaces like parks and squares and schoolyards and so on in ways that facilitate both the activities that young girls and young women like to do, that facilitate their safety, and that can create spaces for integrated multi-gender activities. So some of the things that are important are kind of nice spaces for socializing. Often in parks, you have a row of benches, but they don't face each other, so it's hard to sit and have a conversation, right? Or when you have playing fields, we find that they're sort of totally male dominated, but there's no comparable space given to sports that girls are more likely to partake in. So that's another solution. There also has to be, consideration to safety elements, because often for girls and teenagers, if their parents don't think the space is safe, they won't let them go there, right? So that has to be considered as well. But there are organizations that are working on those questions.
Jessica Wiggins has an interesting question. How might you recommend incorporating conversations about gender into transportation planning initiatives? You talked a little bit about LA Metro and what they're doing, but maybe you can expand on that particular thought.
Yeah, so there's several areas. So one of which is safety, right? So we've touched on that a little bit, but definitely all over the world on public transportation systems, women and girls report lots of public harassment and also sexual violence. So safety has to be a key area for that conversation to happen. But I would also recommend that we don't immediately think more police on trains, because that tends to make things much less safe for other groups of people. So we have to kind of think outside of that box. Conversations about routes, timing, and frequency of service also have gendered components to them. So as I mentioned, women tend to take multiple shorter trips on public transportation. Often these trips are not simply linear trips from the suburbs into the city, for example, but they involve trips to other residential neighborhoods, to daycare and school zones, but a lot of transportation systems are not really set up for that. Physical accessibility is really important. Space for strollers, space for pregnant people to sit. Those are issues that really affect people's ability to move on the system. And affordability is really key. So especially if you're hopping on and off the system a lot and using the system quite a lot, making sure that it's affordable, that women are often kind of penalized by traveling with children and having to pay extra for children, essentially. So those are just a few areas where you can, start to have those conversations.
I'm going to combine the next two questions. Kathy Maris, who's with the Glasgow School, says, are there cities, countries, or cultures that you feel are getting it right? And if you look in the Q&A, you'll see there's another comment from Dr. Shabam Ludafali, who says, who believes that Japan's getting it right in many of the things that you're describing, even with public toilets. I don't know if you're familiar with Japan, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are about as Kathy says, cities, countries, and cultures that are getting this right.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with Japan, but I do know that they have a much better kind of culture of things like providing public toilets, and have come up with very innovative technologies and designs to make sure that those spaces feel safe, that they're clean, that they are very affordable or free to use, which is great, because in many, I think, North American cities, we've kind of ceded the world of the public toilet to Starbucks, right? Or the donut shop on the corner. There's an assumption that if people need to use the toilet, that they can use those spaces, but actually that's not true for everybody, and puts a burden on those businesses to kind of monitor and clean and provide for those spaces. So yeah, places that there are good public toilets. A number of European cities have been way ahead of the curve in terms of gender mainstreaming. So really building a gender analysis into every element of urban budgeting, right? Like asking, okay, where are we putting our money? And as we're deciding where we're putting our money, like what is the gender equity analysis of those decisions? Places that really prioritize non-car transit, I think, are doing a great job. It's not always explicitly put forward as a gender equity solution, but I think in many ways it does have gender equity impacts. It's much safer to not have cars racing up and down streets all the time, and to provide a wider variety of modes of transportation, public, bike, walk, and so on. And I think often in the sort of Nordic countries, it's not just a design principle, but it also has to be matched with like a policy commitment to gender equality. So we can't just design our way out of gender inequalities. We also have to have things like, parental leave and affordable childcare, and a good healthcare system, and affordable housing, and all of those elements are really have to be in the mix as well.
Okay, here's another question. You talk about the community a lot. From my experience working with public feedback, you almost always end up with competing interests and stakeholders who have seemingly mutually exclusive interests. I think actually in your presentation, you argued against that. But what's your advice for maintaining that kind of balance when people either have or seem to have or think they have mutually exclusive interests?
Yeah, I mean, public participation and community consultation is very messy, isn't it? And this is why a lot of like planners and developers kind of want to avoid it, because it's not easy to know what to do with all of that. And, it's true that you might get competing points of view. I think one way to approach that is to think about like, what is really the core intention of whatever your project is? And if one of the core intentions of that project is to improve equity, gender equity, for example, but maybe other kinds of equity, then maybe that's the kind of feedback that you prioritize, right? Or you look at like who has historically been the most marginalized and what can we do to make their lives better. And yeah, maybe there's somebody who's going to disagree with that, but if they have not been on the kind of, receiving end of the harms of past, urban design, redlining, structural violence and so on, well, maybe it's time to kind of lift up somebody else. So it might be a matter of figuring out right from the start, like what is the sort of core value and intention behind the project.
Another attendee asked, there's a push to allow trans girls and women to compete in sports with biological girls and women. How is this viewed in light of what is called by the questioner deadly design? Will we see no more numerous serious injuries among the biological girls and women?
I mean, first of all, I'm just going to say that I really don't have any expertise in the question of sport. So I don't have any, grounds to answer that question. I'm not totally sure what the intention of it is, but I will just say that, I am, what word can I use? A trans ally, right? Someone who does not believe that trans people, whether women or men, are a threat to so-called biological women and girls, whether that's in the realm of sport, whether that's in bathrooms and schools and so on. So for me, again, I think, who has historically faced the most harm, right? Who's been the most marginalized. And, I would rather kind of center that perspective than, perhaps do more harm by increasing the marginalization that those groups face.
There's a factual question. Somebody is doing research on aesthetic crosswalks and is curious how widely they're implemented. So simply wants to know the rainbow crosswalk picture in your second slide, where was that taken?
Yeah, so that image is taken in Toronto's what's known as the Gay Village, or the Church Street Village in Toronto, which for a long time was the center of kind of the gay male community. There's also trans flag painted crosswalks. But right here in my small town, and by small, I mean small, 5,000 people where I live right now, we also have rainbow crosswalks. To me, as I said, when I mentioned kind of telling a different story, those aesthetic elements, whether it's a crosswalk, whether it's, a statue, a flag, a street sign, I think they matter. They are one way of communicating to people, like, we care about your story. Your presence here matters. We want people to feel welcome. We don't tolerate discrimination. Again, it has to be matched up with real policy and action and money and so on. It's not the solution in and of itself, but the symbolic realm does communicate to us what matters to us, right? What we care about, what stories are important. So I think, you know, we can see those things as, and again, they're often very inexpensive interventions, right? So if cities want, you know, something you can do tomorrow, like you can paint a rainbow crosswalk, right? For a few $100s, not millions of dollars of investment.
Okay, we have time for one more question. I'm going to pose one more question from our audience. How do you create experiences and spaces that are more tailored for different gender experiences without reinforcing gender stereotypes and norms?
Yeah, great question. And I think this harkens back to long debates about, you know, whether we need women's spaces. Even in some places, I think in Japan, in a couple of cities, they have like women only subway cars, right? So that's sort of I would call it kind of a band-aid solution to questions of like public sexual harassment on public transit, but it's certainly one thing in the toolkit. But yeah, ultimately, I would, I think, agree with the spirit of the question that we don't want to fall back into stereotypes of the idea, again, that there is this distinct gender binary, that men and women are inherently so different that they can't kind of use the same spaces, but more to recognize that actually there is a lot of overlap, and we can, you know, start from there, but also that when we you know, are thinking about, you know, gender equity related solutions. So even something like an accessible public transportation system, that's not just a gender benefit, right? That many other groups in society benefit from that as well. So I think we can also ask, like, well, what interventions can we make that lift up people who have been historically quite excluded from cities and see those as having the greatest impact.
Right. Well, Leslie Kern, author of Feminist City, thank you very much for being with us today. And thanks to the many, many people who tuned in. Feminist City is available for purchase from retailers nationwide. You can see the link to Verso Books up there where you can learn more. Verso is the publisher. Our next Urban Reads will be in 2 months, October 13th, featuring Elizabeth Corver Glenn, a PhD in sociology from Rice, discussing her book, Race Brokers, Housing Markets and Segregation in the 21st Century Urban America. And the Kinder Institute Forum returns December 1st with yet another one of my former professors, Donald Shoup, discussing parking reform and the high cost associated with parking. You can register for the upcoming webinars by visiting kinder.rice.edu or by scanning the QR code, which I think is up on the top of your screen there right now. Just scan the QR code and you can register. So again, we thank you for being with us today. Thank you to Leslie Kern, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.